Migrants, refugees attempting to reach Western Europe are facing a tough choice. Battle Hungary's tough new defenses at the border or travel through Croatia on an uncertain path to European Union nations that are welcoming them. But already, as Steve Nannis reports, Croatian authorities say they'll need help to handle the huge crowds headed for the border.
Just one day after opening their borders to migrants and refugees hoping to reach Western Europe, Croatian authorities say they're overwhelmed. In just 24 hours, more than 7,600 people entered Croatia through at least 7 border crossings. At times, it was chaos. Thousands broke through police barriers set up at a train station. The focus on Croatia comes just one day after riot police in Hungary used tear gas and water cannons to turn back migrants trying to enter that country from Serbia.
They tried to help us with some food, for children and women, but we had really hard time there.
The crossing sealed on Wednesday had been a popular path for tens of thousands of migrants, many of them fleeing violence in their home countries of Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Migrants passing through Croatia face another threat, landmines. Doctors Without Borders warns people crossing borders away from formal checkpoints could encounter some 51,000 landmines left over from the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. Aid workers call this exodus the largest refugee and migrant crisis in Europe since World War II. More than 430,000 migrants have reached Europe by sea so far this year. That's double the number that came in all of last year. The International Organization for Migration says the response from world governments is not keeping pace with the growing crisis. I'm Steve Nannis reporting.
And joining us now with his insight on this crisis, Washington Post reporter Robert Samuels. Robert, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So it seems many European countries are now rethinking how many migrants they want to welcome across their borders, as the Post article today says, abruptly yanking the welcome mat. So why now, Robert? What's changed?
I think a lot of the countries in Europe were not predicting the amount of migrants that were expected to come through this border. They've been surprised by the thousands and thousands that are coming by day, by foot, by boat, who are looking for refuge and asylum. And because of that, it's really hard to to control the flow of migration. And that's what a lot of the countries in Europe are concerned about, whether or not they can actually handle the amount of people that are coming through the border.
In recent days, which country would you say has done the biggest about face in terms of allowing these migrants or welcoming these migrants into the country?
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on. I think in Germany, people were pretty surprised because they at first had this open arms policy in which they said, yes, we understand your plight. We know that this is a European principle to help people when they're in need. Come, we'll help you. And when thousands heeded to that call, they were pretty surprised. And they were also surprised that some of their fellow countries in Europe did not help them lift that burden. And because of that, they've had to seriously reconsider their migration policy toward these refugees, these migrants.
So now we have these countries pumping the brakes. These crowds, though, are huge. And I'm wondering how successful these countries have been in the past few days at blocking access to border crossers.
Well, in Hungary, which has really sort of taken the lead on refusing to allow migrants in, they've been pretty successful, much to the chagrin of the people who are trying to get in there, to get through to more welcoming countries in Western Europe. By the weekend, before Hungary officially closed the border, you saw people coming in at the rate of about 9,000 per day. Earlier this week, that rate was about 200 people being detained trying to get into Hungary. So they've been the most proactive. I think in the next few days, you'll see some interesting things that will happen in Serbia and in Croatia, where migrants are trying to find distinct other routes to get to more welcoming countries in Western Europe.
Meanwhile, in Germany, lawmakers there are looking to change their asylum laws because of this crisis. What would that proposed legislation do?
that proposed legislation would help to cut some of the benefits that people who come to Germany would get. In Germany, they're known for being a very welcoming country, provided migrants and refugees want to do the work to help integrate themselves into society. They have very generous social programs compared with the rest of Europe. Now they're considering trying to tighten up some of those social programs so their country would be less attractive to people, and they might make a choice to go to another place in Europe that is also welcoming, a place like Sweden or the Netherlands.
Some of these countries are threatening prison, jail time,
yes,
for illegally crossing their borders. But considering the war zones and the horrific conditions that these people are trying to escape, we've probably only seen a small sliver of that experience in our media coverage around the world. Will threats of prison or any other punishment be enough to stop this?
Well, I think there's two really important things to remember. The first important thing is that tens of thousands of people have already left places in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and even beyond that, some parts of Asia, in hopes of asylum. They've sold their houses, they've run away from situations in which their families and their lives are threatened. They're already on that journey, and so even if people stop today, there'd be tens of thousands of people in transport who are looking for a place to go. I think the other thing to remember is that, you know, there's a very stubborn hope about people who leave, and the threat of militarization and being arrested. At some point, you're still alive, and so that might help take some of those numbers down, but that won't completely eradicate the problem.
There's another horrific element to this crisis there in Europe. Croatia's decision to close roads crossing into Serbia raises a risk that these asylum seekers may push into fields and forests which are littered with landmines from the Balkan Wars back in the 1990s. Do we know are these refugees even aware of that risk?
Oh, absolutely. The people who are migrating, they're typically pretty well off because they're able to afford the trip, which includes using smugglers and taking boats and walking. And they're they keep in touch with the news and in contact with people through their iPhones. People discovered that route through Croatia using Google Maps, actually. And so they're pretty aware that there are places in Croatia that have landmines. People have been warning them about that. But the thing to remember, I think, for a lot of them is these are people in very desperate situations. And they are trying to make the best decision for them at a time when their lives are being threatened.
So far, the EU has agreed to accept and settle only 40,000 asylum seekers across 22 member nations, and then plans for another 120,000 have been pretty bitterly opposed by Central and Eastern European countries. That's just a drop in the bucket, as you were saying. These crowds are only going to continue to pour out of that region. Meanwhile, we have American leaders discussing this, debating this on the campaign trail, the presidential campaign. President Obama's called for the U.S. to accept at least 10,000 migrants. And you have a lot of lawmakers and leaders, Republicans and Democrats, expressing concern about militants and extremists. Those are valid worries considering the so-called Islamic State in that region, the Syrian battlefield, right?
There's a lot to be worried about. I think for the United States, the question of the number of migrants they're taking in, it's a little bit of a false question. It's a bit of a red herring because they have to get to the United States, like we talked about before. It's a very expensive journey, and that's why people choose the route to go through Europe. There are concerns about the Islamic State. There are concerns about people who might practice some forms of terrorism, but I think also it's important to remember that that is not necessarily emblematic of Islam or the people who are going. Most of the people who you speak with along those border towns, they're fleeing from the same conditions that people in Europe and the United States are worried about that they'll bring to those countries and those areas. They're all concerned about the same thing. One doesn't necessarily lead to the other.
An important point. Robert Samuels, Washington Post reporter, really appreciate your time today.
No problem. Thank you.
We're back with more News Talk in a moment. Stay with us.